Hello, everyone. As a SILA Foundation's Executive Director, I welcome you to the last webinar of 2022. Today, I'm honored to welcome back Dawn Kuhlman. In 2020, Dawn enlightened us with her approach to the neuroscience of conflict. And today, she's sure to equally impress us with her as she takes us on a forgiveness exploration. We only have 1 hour. Questions go in the chat. Dawn will address them when she can, or at the end. Any left unanswered will be addressed by email. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording along with the PowerPoint slides will be available in the SILA Foundation's webinar library within the next week. You'll receive a link to this information in your post-webinar survey email communication. Now, with all that said, I am passing it over to you, Dawn. It's all yours.
Well, hello, and thank you for having me today. It's good to be back. So, the year is 1998, and I am in graduate school at the University of Dayton, and I have to do a thesis. And as many of you know, a thesis is a huge undertaking. What was supposed to be a 2-year project turned into a 4-year project, but we finally got there. I finally have my master's degree. But it's where we gather data, and we decided, when I say we, I mean my professor, in terms of him being a thesis chair, Dr. Mark Rye, decided to navigate the world of forgiveness. And so to that point, forgiveness really hadn't been quantified, right? So it's this abstract concept that goes all the way back to the days of the Bible in terms of what we should do, what it sort of looks like, but it doesn't really describe what that means for our mental health. It doesn't really describe what that process looks like. So I did spend 4 years of my life quantifying this abstract concept of forgiveness. So today there's going to be some research talk. It's kind of nerdy at certain points, but I'll really try to explain it in simple terms as much as I can. So today our discussion is on what is forgiveness, thinking about the benefits of forgiveness in terms of our health and our mental health, looking at my research results. I will walk you guys through what's called a compassion exercise at the end. So you do have to participate, if you will. And then sort of all through this, we're going to talk about some tools in terms of how to release negative emotions, and then also how to increase our positive emotions. So some good resources. Obviously, I have to promote Dr. Mark Rye. He spent many years of his life helping me navigate this topic. And so he actually went on to produce a book. You can get it off of Amazon. I don't make any money off of that, but if anybody had recently gone through a divorce or any sort of relationship ending, he's got a whole workbook on how to work through forgiveness components. And although it doesn't say forgiveness on there, that is a huge portion of that work. And then Dr. Fred Luskin. I cite him a lot in terms of, he's got a lot of good steps in terms of a forgiveness process. And so he's been able to really help people think about what it is and what it isn't. And so I will, like I said, cite him today in terms of his work. So what is forgiveness, right? I think we hear this term all the time. We use it sort of just freely, but really, what is it? And it's the experience of peace and understanding that can be felt in the present moment. You forgive by challenging the rigid rules you have for other people's behavior, and by focusing your attention on the good things in your life as opposed to the bad. And so I put on here, it's an antidote for a case of the shoulds. And what I notice, and so just to kind of spring forward to what I do, I'm a mediator. I've been mediating cases for families for the last 20 years, which is crazy to say that. So almost 20 years. I was trained in 2003. And so I worked for the court system, and then I had a private practice for 7 years. And then now I work for a statewide nonprofit mediation program called March Mediation. And that's all we do. We provide free mediation legal services to families in the state of Missouri. But when I work with families, and this can be with any, whether it's families or just anyone in a conflict, what keeps people sort of connected, and it's a concept that I call negative intimacy. Actually, I didn't create that term. Isolana Ricci created that term. She had written a book called Mom's House, Dad's House, but just anybody who stays connected through negative dynamics, whether it's fault finding, blame, arguing, it's almost like they stay connected through this word should, like what they think this other person should or should not be doing. And so when you let go of that sort of should component, it releases you in terms of you can't control that person anyway, right? Always thinking about things I have control over and then the things I don't have control over. It's a release of what you think you should have control over or what you think someone should be doing. And when you release that, it's amazing how freeing that can be. So forgiveness is, and this is part of Fred Luskin's work, it's the peace you feel when you put grievances to rest. It's for you and not the offender. I think that is a huge part of this. So many times people would say, but if I forgive this person, they'll think what they did is right. And the flip of that is that forgiveness is not for them, right? It's for you. There's a lot of, we'll talk about the research in terms of what the inability to forgive does to you mentally and physically. And specifically, that was part of what my research was on, was looking at forgiveness and self-forgiveness and the impact that it has on your mental health. Taking back your power, it's part of what forgiveness is. Taking responsibility for how you feel. Forgiveness is about your healing and not about the people who hurt you. It's a trainable skill. And it's not just a one and done, right? Like we can be triggered. We can kind of revert back to old ways of thinking sometimes that aren't always the best. And so thinking about how it's just like learning to throw a baseball, it says, or learning to ride a bike. You got to just keep doing it to stay good at it. Helps you get control over your feelings, can improve your mental and physical health. Say it's a way for you to become the hero or the shero, as I sometimes say, instead of a victim. Because it's one thing, you can be a victim, but it's the victim mindset that really gets us in trouble sometimes. And so you can be both, right? You can have, you can be a victim, but you can also be the hero of the story. You don't have to have that victim mindset. And so always thinking about empowerment, like that's sort of the theme of all of this, is how can we empower ourselves? How can we focus on our choices? How can we begin to look at things differently? And that's part of what forgiveness has to it. It's just got that flavor to it. And then on there it says forgiveness is a choice in terms of I can choose to stay in a negative intimacy dynamic, or I can choose the release of forgiveness. So studies reveal, obviously forgiveness is very healing. People who are more forgiving report fewer health problems. It leads to less stress. It leads to fewer physical symptoms. A failure to forgive may be more important than hostility as a risk factor for heart disease. So it's that sort of internal tearing you up type of mindset or component. People who blame other people for their troubles have higher incidences of illnesses such as cardiovascular disease and cancers. People who imagine not forgiving someone show negative changes in blood pressure, muscle tension, and immune response. People who imagine forgiving their offender know immediate improvement in their cardiovascular and muscular nervous systems. And then, hang on, my computer's trying to hide stuff from me. But anyway, there we go. Even people with the devastating loss, they can feel better psychologically. Wait a minute, I'm trying to read. Can't read that. Let me try to see if I can minimize it. No, I can't. Maybe somebody else can help me with that one. Oh, anyway, we'll keep moving on. So thinking about how much time we spend when we are stuck in that negative intimacy dynamic, like how much time we spend thinking about that person or thinking about what they've done wrong to us. And we call that renting space in our head. And so there we go. How much time do we spend thinking about our hurts and disappointments? And so today I'm going to sprinkle some real life scenarios of when I work with families or work with folks. And one of them is, I asked this lady once, I said, how much time do you think you spend thinking about what this other person? And she said, I honestly think I spend about 58 minutes a day, or 58 minutes of every hour. Like she's just consumed. Like consumed with thinking about how this person had wronged her or how this person is doing all these things. And so just thinking about how to get your power back, like, why do we want to give that person all of our power? Why do we want to give them all of our time, all of our energy, all of our thoughts? Thinking about, again, that whole idea of I have control of my thoughts, right? So I want to be in control of things. So just always thinking about how we can flip it around so this person isn't taking up all of this space in our mind. Thinking about how much intensity is there. And then I like the question, are you renting out more space to what is wrong than what is right? So there's a really good positive psychology researcher. His name is Sean Aker. And he always talks about, like, what are we focusing on? All of us can go into a room and notice something completely different. And so just thinking about, where are you putting your focus? And that then determines on how we see people and how we see life. And it certainly has a huge impact on our mental and physical health. The other component of it is, just thinking about how we see our life. And I'm going to talk later about gratitude. It's got a ton of research to show that it's obviously healthy and good for you. But even if something is truly bad, what's the benefit of seeing it that way, right? Like, that becomes the question. And so thinking about, even if something is a certain way, if it doesn't make us feel good, then maybe we can think about how we can start to see that differently. So forgiveness. This was actually really big at the time in terms of our research, and it went on to be what's called a poster session at the American Psychological Association at a big conference in Hawaii at that time in 2004, but I didn't have any money to go. So my professor, he just played all my research for me. Looking back, I should have just taken out a loan and gone. It would have been a super cool experience. But anyway, I was in my 20s and coming out of graduate school. And so being able, like I said, to quantify this abstract concept of forgiveness. So I do want to show you, if you're ever interested, if you want to go to our March mediation website, there's all of my research is on that website. Let me just go ahead and I'll take you there. If you can't see it, let me know, but it should. So if you go to research and publications underneath the marchmediation.org, there's a forgiveness tab. And so my whole thesis is actually on there. Some what's called ed talks that I've done on my thesis are on there, but you can actually see the scales that we use to assess this abstract concept of forgiveness. And so we've got what's called a forgiveness of self. And so these are just some of the questions, like, I can't stop thinking about how I wronged this person. I deserve to have good things happen to me. I spend time thinking about how to punish myself for having wronged this person. And so when we were doing this research, we had, for 4 months, all the Psych 100 students at the University of Dayton were my little research guinea pigs, my research rats, if you will. And so we had, they had to complete this assessment. They had to complete the forgiveness of others scale. They had to complete the only other forgiveness scale that really existed at that time, because, as you know, you have to, are you really assessing what you think you're assessing? That's part of what we had to determine. The other part of it was then assessing self-esteem, guilt, shame, anger, depression, religion. We looked at religion to see if it made a difference in terms of people's ability to forgive, and I'll get to those results. Spoiler alert, it does not, but anyway. And so this was the self-forgiveness scale that we used. And then there is this forgiveness scale of others, because being able to forgive yourself and then being able to forgive what other people do is actually two different things, and is actually related to different mental health components. We did not realize that, or we kind of had some ideas on it, but the results were actually pretty interesting. And so I'll talk about that today. But you can see how some of these questions, like, I pray for the person who wronged me. So we call those what's called presence of positive. Like, I actually want to think positively about this other person. And then we've got these other ones, like, I spend time thinking about ways to get back at the person who wronged me. And so we call those like the negative, right? So you can get a difference between like the negative and the positive. And that actually, I'll talk about what that means as well, because one is related more to mental health than the other. So we'll jump back into this. The good news is at the end of the day, they proved my assessments proved to be reliable, meaning that taken over time again and again and again, they were consistent, and they proved to be valid, meaning that compared to other assessments, we were actually tapping into what we wanted to assess. And as a researcher, a research talk, that's what you want. You want things to be reliable and you want them to be valid. And they were both. So we were on the right track. So the negative. So it's designed, so absence of negative, meaning like I don't have any negative feelings towards you, right? It's designed to measure the degree to which the person has overcome negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors about this person who has offended them. And so, like I said, some of those questions where I can't stop thinking about how I was wronged by this person, I spend time thinking about ways to get back at this person, like this just really negative stuff. And then the presence of positive was designed to measure the degree to which the person has the presence of positive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors towards a specific person. So like when somebody says, oh, I'm going to pray for them, right? Like, are they really going to pray for them? And even if they are sincere, does that really make a difference on your mental health? The answer is no. You can actually say, I'm going to pray for them, or you can wish good things for them, but it didn't really make an impact on your mental health in terms of your ability to forget, like if you were still holding on. So the negative seemed to have a heavier weight to it than positive stuff coming out of your mouth. Does that make sense? So when we're thinking about the ability to forgive, we need to think about how can we really start to work on. It's good. I'm not gonna say that you shouldn't be positive or you shouldn't want to pray for that person or you shouldn't want good things for them. I want you to do that. But when we're really looking at your mental health, we're really looking at the ability to reduce or release the negative emotions surrounding that, because that's what really seems to have an impact on folks. So one of my research questions was basically like, how do we look at forgiveness of self? How do we look at forgiveness of others? And what does all this mean in terms of our mental health? So when we looked at anger, so state anger means that you are just always, or you get mad, but then you calm back down. Trait anger means like it's something inside of you, like you're just angry all the time, right? And then we looked at depression and we looked at self-esteem. So being able, like when you were not able to forgive other people, obviously you had higher levels of anger. So the anger towards other people was really related to obviously the inability to forgive other people, but it really wasn't related to self, right? So it was sort of what we called this extra punitive orientation, if you will. Whereas if you were unable to forgive yourself, that seemed to be related to depression. But the interesting thing is the inability to forgive others was also related to depression. And self-esteem was related more so to the inability to forgive yourself rather than the inability to forgive others. So it's interesting how we can really start to, when you pull out the spaghetti, the spaghetti bowls of mental health, spaghetti strands of mental health stuff, what everything is connected to is, I think, pretty interesting. So looking at, we said we're inability to forgive yourself and or others is both related to depression. The inability to forgive others is more related to anger. And then the inability to forgive yourself is more related to self-esteem. Then we were looking at things like guilt and shame. And like I said, religious orientation. One of the interesting things is that the University of Dayton is actually a private Catholic school. And so a lot of those kids are of Catholic religious background. And so we thought that that would maybe make a difference or have an impact on forgiveness. And for our purposes of our study, like I said, religious orientation had no impact. It had no relationship with the ability to forgive oneself or to forgive others. When we began to look at guilt and shame, And let me see, I think let's just talk about what guilt and shame are, because I think there's sometimes some confusion around that. Guilt is this idea that I did something bad. It's like an external thing, whereas shame is I'm a bad person. That's an internal thing, right? So going back to both forgiveness of others and the forgiveness of self were both negatively related to guilt and shame, meaning that if you were able to forgive yourself and able to forgive others, you had lower levels of guilt and shame, which makes sense. And then self-consciousness, I sort of like to describe self-consciousness as almost like when you're in fifth grade and you're overly anxious about what you look like, or maybe middle school time when you're really self-conscious, right? So the inability to forgive yourself was related to self-consciousness, which kind of makes sense because you think about self-esteem, a hyper self-conscious, it just kind of makes sense, and all of that would be connected. But the inability to forgive others had nothing to do with self-consciousness, which is just interesting. So one of the things when we started to dive into shame and guilt, shame was more connected to the inability to forgive self, right? Because if it's an internal thing, then obviously it's going to be harder to forgive yourself if you really think you're a bad person, rather than just thinking I did something stupid or I did something bad. Whereas guilt seemed to have a relationship with both of them. It seemed to be connected to both the inability to forgive oneself and others. The other part of this was a few years ago. A lot of you are probably familiar with Brene Brown. She's a big researcher on guilt and shame and all of these things. She was saying that when they do brain scans of folks who have high levels of shame, it looks just like trauma. It looks just the same as people who have trauma. And so she calls shame shama because it's related to a lot of other things. There was also a TED Talk not too long ago that talked about people who have a hard time saying thank you or I'm sorry or please actually have high levels of shame too. So it's kind of interesting to look at it from all these different angles and what it means. Or when you think about interpersonal relationships, shame's pretty big. It's really just come on the scene, I would say, really within the last decade of being something that mental health researchers are really looking at. So thinking about when someone does us wrong, we decided we were going to tap into this. So one of the interesting things that we did was that we had people rate on a scale of 1 to 5. If I did something to you, I'm going to rate it, right? Let's just say, for example, I'm going to rate it as with 5 being the worst and 1 being the least offensive. If I did something to you, I'm maybe going to rate it at a 2, right? But if you did the same exact thing to me, I'm going to rate that as a 4. And there's lots of reasons why I think that this happens, in terms of even if you and I did the same exact thing to each other, I'm going to rate what you did as worse. Like, I have the data to show that this is what we do as people. What you did was worse, even though I did the same exact thing to you. I think that we as people are able to sort of rationalize, like, I did that because da 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 da, right? Or I did this because you did this, right? Like, we have some sort of justification. But then when you do something to me, even if it's of the same exact magnitude, you did it because you're just a bad person, right? Or you did it because of X, Y, and Z. It's never really logical in that sense. Like, it's more of this emotion-based response. Whereas when we're trying to justify our own stuff, it comes a little bit more like out of the logical side of the brain per se. So this is why revenge never works, right? Let's just cut to the long and the short of it. Because if I'm going to do something to you and then you're going to do the same thing back to me, I'm not going to perceive it as an equal. I'm going to perceive it as more. So it's never going to end, right? Like, I think of the Hatfields and the McCoys. It's just a simple, it literally has to explode. It just keeps going and going. Everybody's got this idea that I'm justified in what I'm doing back. And so oftentimes when I'm working with families, I'm like, one of you just has to stop. It's really that simple, but yet so hard. But somebody just has to modify the behavior to start to change that cycle, because the cycle is just going to keep spiraling. It's never going to just even itself out. Like, okay, now we're done, tit for tat or whatever. No, it's not exactly how that works. So interesting. I think it is interesting, and it's I think it's easy to get caught up in that, but hopefully moving forward, you can put some of that research in your back pocket in terms of, yeah, if I want this to end, I'm just going to have to be the one to end it myself. So thinking about self-compassion, this obviously is connected to being able to forgive others and being able to forgive yourself. And so there's a lot of research on this. But choosing to acknowledge that other people have made the same mistakes. Sometimes when I'm working with folks, they want to dehumanize the person that is sitting across from them, because when you've dehumanized them, it's easy to be angry. It's easy to say and do bad things, if you will. It's easy to have revenge. It's easy to just want something bad for them, right? And that sometimes is what just kind of seeps in these sessions, is just this idea that I want something bad. I want you to be punished. That comes through a lot. People want other people to be punished for the bad things that they've done to them. And so when you start to take this compassionate lens, like at the end of the day, honestly, none of us know what we're doing. We're making it up as we go. We're flying by the seat of our pants. We don't know everyone's story. We don't know where they came from. Just yesterday, I did a talk on trauma and, just talking about all the different ways that people have trauma in their lives. And that as we're working with people in their day-to-day lives, we have no idea what people have been exposed to or what they've had to endure or the coping skills or any of that. So just taking a framework of, so the compassionate trauma-informed lens, just to kind of talk about that for a second, is basically asking that question, like, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, right? And you may not ask people directly that question, but it sort of creates a sort of working framework in your mind, like, what happened? Like, something's off, right? Like, rather than just saying that person's an a-hole, the compassionate lens would be, what happened? Right? Like we can just assume that when somebody, I call it a dysregulation, right? When we can tell when someone is dysregulated, and just thinking about there's something that caused that dysregulation. And so that compassionate lens can help us sometimes think about, we just don't know. We don't know what people are going through. So choosing to say things like we are not alone in our fallibility, motivating ourselves to do something in the future. And I feel like when we take a sort of present and future focused orientation, we don't stay stuck in the past. So this happens a lot when I work with folks. Like they want to go, people will be talking about something. And then I'll say, when did this happen? And they'll say, 5 years ago. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like it's got the passion of like it happening yesterday, but it's connected to something 5 years ago. But that's how our brain is, right? Like our brain has made this connection and it's hard to break that. And when people start talking about the past, I don't have a magic wand. No one's got that magic wand to take that away. And so really part of what I try to make people do is just like, okay, we've got to stay in the present and or the future and think about where we're going, because when we shift our conversations or even our thoughts to the past, that chapter's done. We cannot go back and rewrite that. We have to take our pen and paper and start thinking about how we're going to write the new next chapter and what we learned from that chapter, right? Like it wasn't done for nothing. We didn't make all those stupid mistakes for nothing, but it's like, what can I take from that? And how can I learn from that and move forward with that, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. We all have days where we're like, God, that was stupid. But what did I learn from that? How can I move forward from that? And so thinking about staying in the present think about focusing on the future and trying not to get wrapped up in things that happened in the past are certainly things that help us practice that forgiveness component, practice moving forward, and they don't keep us stuck. When I think of forgiveness, I think of becoming unstuck. And that is a very freeing feeling. Thinking about our self-talk, those are things that we need to work on all the time. A huge component of mindfulness is what's called, identifying our automatic negative thoughts, like ants. So I call them ants, automatic negative thoughts. One day I was talking to a client, and I said something about, you got some ants. And she goes, girl, I got a whole damn ant farm. I was like, oh my gosh, that's funny. But mindfulness of that, right? Like, you first have to have the insight that you've got these automatic negative thoughts, and then you figure out when they pop up, how you combat them, how you change them, how you do it differently. That's what we're trying to do. You're really trying to rewire your brain about things. Let's think about this. Okay, so just practicing kindness with yourself. And then certainly that's going to help us practice kindness and compassion with other folks. So forgiveness requires us to give up suffering. This is huge. Some people like to take on that role of the victim or the martyr, and it truly becomes their identity. And we all know someone like this. And it would be hard if we took away that suffering. It's almost like you would be taking away a part of them. Like, it's, if they weren't miserable or complaining about something, they just wouldn't have anything. They wouldn't even know what to do or what to be, right? So not only would they have to lose that part, then they have to create something new. And that is tough. And I have on here, suffering is a need, and it can become an addiction in terms of just people feeling like they don't deserve good things, or people thinking that, bad things just happen to me, things of that nature. And so when you relinquish that, again, for me, I just think that sounds super freeing, but for some people that can be anxiety provoking. Just the idea of like, if I'm not suffering, if I'm not talking about the bad things that happened. And my grandma is 92 years old right now. Her mental health is starting to go. But she, bless her heart, and my grandpa did her wrong. I'm not going to lie. But most of my childhood, I lived with my grandma, and she would say my grandpa's name in her sleep. Like, we shared a room, and she would just say his name. Like, she was just forever entangled in that. And she would stop people at grocery stores and tell them about the way that my grandpa had done them wrong. And she's an amazing, hardworking lady, but it definitely messed with her. And when I think about this slide, I'm not gonna lie, I think about my grandma in terms of that. It truly be
Dawn, you're lagging a little.
Unfortunately,
You're back.
sometimes get a hotel. Okay. So feeding and nurturing that grievance story, meaning that we've had something that happened to us, and then we just continue to feed it, if you will. And Am I still connected or am I dropped? I think I'm still
We
here
can hear
live
you.
forever. Okay,
I
good.
can hear you.
Okay. It keeps growing. As we talked about, it can keep us stuck in the hurts of the past. It can weigh us down, as we talked about with my grandma, and with lots of the families that I work with. It can become part of our identity. Unfortunately, when we do that, then the other person maintains control. And one of the things that I think is very important to talk about is that we are allowed to have anger. We are allowed to have jealousy. We are allowed to have complex emotions. Sometimes I was talking with a client one day, and I said something about him being angry, and he was like, "I'm not angry." And I was like, "Oh yeah?" And he goes, "They tell me I'm not allowed to be angry." And I was like, "Who's they?" And he was like, "The court and my attorneys." And I was like, "Well, that doesn't even make any sense. Like, even a dog can be angry, right? Like, it's a primitive feeling. Everyone's got anger." But I think it's been turned into a bad word in some way because people have done destructive things with anger, right? And so it's just a matter of thinking about anger is okay. It's just a matter of doing something constructive with it versus destructive with it, or using anger as a way to make change or a way to connect in a good way versus disconnection or fighting, or just unproductive ways to use it. And so I always want people to know, like, you're not a bad person for having negative emotions, right? Like, that does not even make sense. And so, but you have to think about it in terms of, part of mindfulness is like thinking of your emotions like a storm. They come in and then they go, like whether it's depression, acknowledging it, moving on, like sadness or anger, like it comes in and it goes. And it's the same with happiness. It unfortunately doesn't always just stay there, right? It's going to come and it's going to go. And so not getting stuck in something that we're feeling at a particular time, but literally just sort of envisioning it as a storm that's going to come and it's going to go, and not staying stuck in that particular story or that particular emotion. So, some obstacles to forgiveness. So, some people will say things like, well, that's just not forgivable, right? And I get it. I do get it. The trick of it, though, is that if forgiveness is for me and not for you, then everything becomes forgivable. Does that make sense? So it's really for me. So then it makes everything forgivable. Sometimes people say that they can't forgive because they want an apology, or they want some sort of, like we said, it's called restitution, but they want something. They want that person to be punished. They want that person to be remorseful. And unfortunately, a lot of people are not going to get that apology. You're not going to get all the things that you want to make sort of that perfect scenario for forgiveness. And so sometimes you just have to make that choice and do that without all the information or things that you want or things that you need. Sometimes we have those reminders of how we were hurt. And so always thinking about how we can reframe things and try to put some boundaries on our rumination. And so one of the things that I like here is like putting a time limit on it. All right, I'm going to give myself 10 minutes to just really be mad about what happened. And then I'm going to move forward from it, right? Putting those boundaries, I'm still going to be in control of that particular rumination, right? And then I'm going to take that and move forward with it, still helping you feel empowered in that process. The person still engages in hurtful behavior. And so you do sometimes have to set boundaries with people. So forgiveness doesn't mean that you keep setting yourself up for stupidity, okay? That is not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness means I'm not going to let you hurt me anymore the way that you've been hurting me, right? It's that boundary of you do you, I'm going to do me, and I have to take care of my mental health. So sometimes people think that, oh, forgiveness means I'm going to let you keep hurting me again and again. No, actually, forgiveness would mean that you're actually moving on, right? You're not going to stay entrenched in that negative dynamic, or sometimes what you think people should be doing, and that's why you stay in a situation, because they should be doing this. They probably should be, but again, we don't have the magic wand to change behavior of other people. So thinking about how we're going to sometimes have a relationship with someone and not continually keep being hurt by them. And this is a tricky thing because when you just think about relationships in general, there's always this element of rupture and repair, rupture and repair. Like we can't just, anytime we get into a disagreement or a fight, just cut people out of our lives, right? At the end of the day, you'd have no one left. And so always thinking about what the rupture and the repair is going to look like. Because we do have to have people in our life. That's, we were designed for relationships. And so just how can we have the rupture and the repair, and what is that going to look like? And it's a never ending thing, and it's every day, and it's with everyone that we meet and everyone in our family. And we have to continually navigate rupture and repair. And so having these tools is certainly one of the ways that you can start to think about rupture and repair and relationships with, whether it's our kids, whatever. That sort of thinking about what every relationship is going to look like and making sure that there's boundaries around it. That's what keeps us healthy. So thinking about something sacred was violated. So we actually had a scenario here in my town where some kids vandalized a whole graveyard, and there were a lot of tombstones, grave sites that were messed up. And so they took an unconventional approach with those kids, and they had them go before.
Dawn, we're not able to hear you again. If you're able to hear me.
I keep getting a message saying my internet's unstable.
Okay, so, well, we last heard that some kids vandalized a cemetery, and then it went after that. We didn't hear what happened to them. Uh-oh. Think we lost her again.
Okay.
Oh. Yep.
Let me connect. Am I connected?
Yes. Yes.
I'm wondering if I should just connect to my hotspot. I should have probably done that to begin with. Oh well. Now we're halfway. We're almost done. So we'll just keep going.
Well, last we heard that we didn't hear what happened to the children that wrecked the cemetery.
So they came up with their own. They talked with the family members of the cemetery, and everybody came up with their own ways to navigate in terms of the fancy word for that is called restorative justice. But in terms of a lot of times when there's been a crime done, people are using a lot of these restorative justice techniques to essentially promote and do forgiveness. So when there's been a crime done, thinking about, it's not just a matter of putting these kids in the juvie for 6 months or whatever, and making them pay back the victims, and having people have real conversations about, how they hurt the victim. There's actually what's called victim offender mediation, and it's strictly designed to facilitate these sort of discussions. And a lot of times the victim and the offender will go on to have relationships after the fact. We even do this with, we have what's called a shoplifting panels. And so we would have like representatives from, let's say like a Target, the loss prevention, they would be on the panel, they would talk with the kids. And, you're not just stealing an item from a store, like you're impacting a whole subset of people. And getting these kids to recognize, again, it's almost you're creating a human element to something that just didn't have a human component to it. And that's what I feel like is at the heart of a lot of this. It's just making something human again that really has not been human in someone's mind for various reasons. People around you haven't forgiven. And so this is number 6. This is a tough one. And I see this a lot because I work with families. And so here's the tricky part of it. The parents will probably be in my office having a decent conversation, but yet their parents may be the ones paying for the divorce, right? And they want these, like, if they hate this person, then they want the other person to hate them too, right? And you can see sometimes this starts to go on for generations in terms of, I hate this person, so I want you to hate them too, which is not fair, right? And so we've got to think about, who are we surrounding ourselves with, and are the people that we have as our supreme encouraging good mental health for us, especially if we are in certain circumstances where we have to be around, or we have to live with someone who is just stuck in that. But I think first and foremost is just a mindfulness of how that contamination kind of filters out. And, just this whole idea of that people should be able to have their own, here's the word should, right? But people should be able to have their own relationships with folks, and that those relationships might look different than the relationship that you've got. And there's nothing wrong with that. So some strategies for forgiveness, letting go of the small stuff, right? So that's always what they say is like the first step. Try something small and something little, and then you start to build the momentum up. And so even when I'm in a mediation session and I'll say, what's the easiest thing we can talk about today? I would say start with the low hanging fruit, and then you can start to work yourself to these harder, bigger topics. And so everything in life, you just start with something small, you start to make some small successes, and then you keep going forward with that. Express your intention to forgive to a friend, to a pastor, to a therapist, write it down for yourself. Then it becomes real, right? It's not just this abstract idea in your head, something you might get to one day. But when you say, I'm going to do this, then you're like, okay, I'm going to do it. Focus on an inspirational role model. I have my best friend, Janetta. And so do you know how people were wearing those little bracelets like WWJD, like what would Jesus do? But mine was like, what would Janetta do? She's amazing. She is someone who has really good boundaries, but yet is like one of the most kind people in the world. And she's always helpful, but yet she takes care of herself. Like, I'm not kidding. She's truly amazing. And so the way that she navigates conflict, and she just jumps into things, but yet in a respectful, but yet boundary way. I'm telling you, those are the people that you just have to watch. You have to sit back and just watch them and just take notes and be like, this is what I want it to look like. This is what I want it to feel like. And then I ask her questions like, well, how did you do that? Or what made you ask that question? Or how did you feel when you were having that conversation? Always trying to be curious and try to learn from these people who just seem to be naturals at navigating the difficult parts of the world. So number 4, expand and shift your focus, change the channel, focus on gratitude, right? That's part of what we talked about earlier. Sean Aker, his positive psychology stuff. He's got a TED Talk, by the way. He's absolutely crazy. You're going to watch that and you're going to be like, this guy's from another planet. But I think you have to have a different mindset to be a positive psychologist to begin with. But he's got a lot of research. I think he was a professor at Harvard for a while. He might still be, but they had their students every day for 30 days write 2 expressions of gratitude about something. And it could not be the same thing every day. So every day you had to find 2 things that you were grateful for. And they showed that this actually had improved mental health by the end of the 30 days. He also really talks about just mindfulness or sitting in the calm, trying to clear our mind of clutter. He really puts a big emphasis on that as well. And so just maybe think about for the next 30 days, what you can focus on. And like I said, it can never be the same thing because it's really easy. This would be me. I'm thankful for my family and my friends, like just something easy that you don't have to think much about. And some days it is hard to focus on the gratitude, especially when, I don't know about you guys, but it's kind of cold here and it's starting to snow, and that just makes me a little grumpy. Number 5, thinking about your faith or just something bigger than yourself. I think that can be helpful. And like I said, it doesn't hurt you to pray for the other person. But again, for me, in terms of mental health component, you certainly have to make sure you're also addressing the negative emotions. Think of a time when you did something hurtful. So thinking about how you've done things, humanizing each other, empathizing with the person, acknowledging their pain. Oh my gosh, that is tough. I'm sitting there with two people who I'm going to just say hate each other, trying to acknowledge this other person's pain. Oh my gosh, that is really tough for people to do. Developing a forgiveness ritual. So sometimes people, I did this once as an activity, and I had everybody write down a particular experience that they wanted to move on from, or a person they found really challenging and they wanted to forgive. And then we took all of that and we put it in a paper shredder there in the classroom. And it was fun. Or, burning things, just carrying something, I guess, as a symbol, like a rock in your pocket, in terms of, something that's going to help you as a reminder to keep moving forward, not focus on the negative of something. It's kind of nice to have that cathartic release every now and then. So sometimes when I'm working with folks, I will have them do a visualization. I actually just did a Zoom mediation with some folks out on the West Coast last week, and it was a kind of convoluted mess. They were friends from undergrad, and then they had a business together, and then it was their spouses that got into a fight. There was like 3 circles. So we had 3 circles, and I had it up on the screen. And they wanted their friendship saved. They wanted their business saved. And they knew that the significant other component of it would eventually just kind of fall into place, but they didn't know what it was going to look like. And so literally, I just had these 3 overlapping circles on the screen. And I said, I don't want you to think about how it's going to happen or what it's going to look like. I just want you to visualize those 3 circles overlapping. Because sometimes we get so bogged down in the details or the stress of what something should look like, that really we just need to create the vision of the big picture of what it is, and not worry about the next step, right? Sometimes life just organically works out. We don't have to always have a plan, if you will. But oftentimes too, whenever I'm working with high conflict families, and I try to have the parents imagine 2 rings overlapping each other. And obviously one is one parent and there's the co-parent, but they sometimes can't even visualize that. It's so anxiety provoking to even think about the overlapping rings, that they'll say, I can't do that, Dawn, but this is what I can do. And then they'll draw me a picture of it. It'll be 2 rings, and then they'll be connected by lines. I'm like, that's a start. And then just trying to get those rings closer to a dynamic, in terms of they have to overlap if they plan on co-parenting, because what they're doing was really destructive. So sometimes, even if we don't have a plan, we can't think about what it's going to look like exactly. Just visualize that feeling that you want to have, or visualize what you want it to look like. And if you can't think about that in terms of like a real person, think about it. I do symbols. I often will draw stuff, and it'll mean something. And so just thinking about that feeling, maybe what the symbols will look like. It doesn't have to be exact, but you can start to get there, right? You don't have to have a full plan. You don't even have to understand how it's going to work. Just start to visualize what that is going to look like. So one of the activities would be, thinking about at night, just closing your eyes, imagining a different or transformed relationship with this person. Imagine calm feelings. Like I said, thinking in shapes or symbols may be easier. And this is something that you have to practice. So with the 2 guys that I met with last week, I said, you just do this every night before you go to bed. Think about those 3 circles. Don't think about the details of it. Just put calm feelings with it when you think about it. And like I said, it'll all sort of start to work itself out. How are we doing on time? What is this? Okay. Oh, it looks like we've only got 5 minutes left. So I guess let's do this activity, and then it'll be perfect timing. I do want everyone to do this activity with me. So this is, if you Google this, this is on the internet. It's an exercise. His name is Harry Palmer, and is this called Just Like Me. But I use this with clients sometimes. And when they are getting really stressed about the other person, and there is that sort of dehumanization that's taken place, or a lot of animosity. So I want you to close your eyes and think about someone who is maybe giving you a hard time right now in your life, or someone who is just you find to be very challenging, or someone that you feel like they take too much space. They're renting too much space in your mind. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and just repeat this to yourself, right? With your attention on the other person, repeat to yourself, just like me, this person is seeking some happiness for his or her life. Just like me, this person. Just like me, this person has known sadness, suffering, and despair. Just like me, this person is seeking to fill his or her needs. Just like me, this person is learning about life. And when I have folks do this, I'll say, imagine the other person in diapers, right? Like you're in diapers, this other person's in diapers, because we're all just kids, right? We're trying to navigate and learn life. And none of us really have the answers. And so just always trying to be curious and to be mindful that all of us are trying to do the best that we can with the resources that we have available to us. That's a good reframe. So there's a lot of gratitude challenges out there. And that might be something you could do in your workplace or in your home life. Do it. This will be the perfect month. It's November. It's everything to be grateful for, right? So be grateful for what you have, be grateful for everything around you, and be grateful for who you are, right? So there's a lot of layers to that in terms of what we can be grateful for. And so maybe that would be a fun activity to do with your family, or something you could do at dinner every night, having everybody talk about what they're grateful for and making sure it's different every night. So I'm out of here, I think, unless you guys have questions. But if you ever want to contact me directly, you can email me at dawnkuhlman@marchmediation.org or call me directly. And then some of the, like I said, a lot of the resources that I talked about today are available on the marchmediation.org website.
Thank you, Dawn. You are amazing. And I do agree that this was divinely timed webinar, if you're able to hear me. I'm closing to everyone who can hear me. Today's webinar is public, so we appreciate if you share the invitations with others. The next one will be going out in January.
Yeah.
Oh, and we wish you a happy holiday season. We'll see you back in January. Bye, Dawn. I'll be in contact. Bye. Bye, everybody.